Welcome to Carey Open, a podcast where we open a window into the world of Carey Baptist College. This episode is a recording from our chapel gathering called Karakia.
Thus far in Mark's Gospel, Jesus' teaching and Jesus himself have been received with enthusiasm and amazement. He's preached the good news. He has healed. He has cast out demons. And news about him is spreading. People are flocking to Jesus. If there was a backing soundtrack for this initial phase of the ministry of the Mark and Jesus, I imagine it would be exciting, it would be fast-paced, and it would be triumphant. By the end of chapter 1, Jesus' popularity is so great, it's actually become a bit of a problem. After healing a man with leprosy, who doesn't keep quiet about it despite being asked to, Jesus can't go into town without getting mobbed. And even though he stays in lonely places, we find in 145 that people still come to him from everywhere. But an ominous note is about to creep into Jesus' personal theme music. As chapter 2 begins and Jesus enters Capernaum, and we, the reader, head towards the passage that we're going to look at in 2:23 to 3:6, we hit a series of incidences that introduce human opposition and conflict into the narrative. In the eyes of the scribes and the Pharisees, Jesus has started to cross a line. They might be wondering if perhaps his popularity is going to his head. From their perspective, he starts making wild claims. He forgives the sins of a paralytic. Only God can forgive sins. He calls a tax collector and then he eats with him and with a whole bunch of other sinners. His disciples don't fast. Worse, he doesn't seem to have read the book on how to win friends and influence people, because although it's true that the crowd is captivated by the authority of Jesus, in this honor-shame culture, as Jesus begins to enter into debates with the scribes and the Pharisees and wins, Jesus starts to become a threat. So we arrive, a little breathlessly, at our passage where we find ourselves shifting nervously in our seats as we begin two rather curious incidences that revolve around the Sabbath, one in a field of grain and another in a synagogue. What is Jesus up to? It begins in 2:23, as we've heard, with an account of Jesus' disciples picking grain on the Sabbath as they move through a field. The Pharisees question Jesus about this, asking, why are the disciples doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, this question about what is or is not lawful is going to come up several times as we move through this passage. And they signal that Jesus is entering an ongoing conversation. And this is not a conversation that allows us to simply dismiss the questions and objections of the Pharisees as if they're simply being nitpicking legalists. Jesus takes this challenge seriously. He's entering a debate. And the question is not about whether or not the Sabbath should be observed, but how and why. Although the Sabbath might be something that seems a little strange to us today, it was a multifaceted and vital aspect of Jewish life. It was not reducible to simply being about an individual's actions. It was an institution of national significance. The Sabbath was a distinguishing mark of Jewish identity, national pride, at a time when the Jewish people were under occupation by the Romans. They sought to preserve Israel as a holy nation while living as part of a multi-ethnic population that did not recognize Israel's God. The Sabbath, running from sundown on Friday to sunset on Saturday, was a time to stop and rest, a time when no work was done, a time given specifically to Israel by God as a blessing. It has its beginning in the beginning. It's in the creation story in the account of Genesis 2, where we find that God rests from God's work on the seventh day. This rest is a time for God to enjoy and celebrate the good created world as home. The Sabbath rest on the seventh day is later instituted for the nation of Israel. It's one of the 10 commandments given in Exodus 28 to 11 after God brings the Israelites out of Egypt. They are commanded to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. No one is to work on this day. Not sons, not daughters, not servants, not foreigners, not even the animals. And this is linked back to God's own rest on the seventh day. When the commandments are presented by Moses to Israel again in Deuteronomy 5:12 to 15, the Sabbath command is also linked to God bringing Israel out of Egypt and their release from slavery. It's about freedom and release and becomes embedded in this larger pattern of rest for the land and for people, culminating after 7 times 7 years in the 50th year of Jubilee, a rest and a reset for all, where people return to family property, where they eat what the land produces. It's a refresh or a reset that is about the restoration of people and of the created order, about God's justice. It is a pattern of making things as they should be. All this to say, Sabbath is a big deal. Not just because of what it involves, but because of all that it symbolizes. As there is no work to be done on the Sabbath, there are extensive lists of rules that have been developed to ensure that everyone knows what constitutes work. So when the Pharisees accuse Jesus' disciples of doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath, this is a serious charge. But rather than dismissing this charge as unimportant or arguing about whether or not the action constitutes work, Jesus takes a different tact. Moving towards the very purpose of Sabbath, he makes 3 moves. First, he redeploys a story about David and his companions when they were hungry and in need of food, when they unlawfully ate the bread of presence. This is an intriguing rhetorical move to make for Jesus, because it doesn't seem to correlate so well with what Jesus' disciples are doing by plucking grain on the Sabbath. So it's been suggested that what this is an appeal to authority. In the case of the story, the authority of David, a king, to do what is not lawful, taking the bread, to meet the needs of his men. Subsequently then, we would say, well, Jesus, who has a greater claim to authority as Lord of the Sabbath, can use his authority to allow his disciples to do what is not lawful and to pluck grain on the Sabbath. But if we press into the idea that what Jesus actually wants to do is to articulate the purpose of the Sabbath, then we can see Jesus as making the argument that meeting human need honours the Sabbath. Or to put it another way, the Sabbath should not enforce inactivity when that will do harm. Because Sabbath speaks to a vision of society in which people can flourish. And it disqualifies practices that maintain unjust structures. It proactively meets human need. This reading is further reinforced by Jesus' next move to make the statement that the Sabbath was made echoing the creation account. So Sabbath has been made, it's been created for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is meant to be a time of refreshment and rest for the benefit of humans and animals. The Sabbath is a day in which things are as they should be, and the hungry need to be able to fulfill their hunger. Jesus then makes his third move in this section and finishes with this very significant claim. Drawing on imagery from Daniel 7, he says, "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Mic drop. In this section of Mark, we have now seen Jesus as Lord in relation to spiritual powers, physical illness, forgiveness of sins, and now as Lord of sacred time, of Sabbath. Marcus explains that with this Christological claim, Jesus appeals to God's original will in creation and its eschatological renewal in his own ministry. This is no longer a debate about what is lawful on the Sabbath, but about the significance of the Sabbath and all that it points to. And Jesus has just claimed the authority to define it. So as we come to the end of this pericope and shift from the field to the synagogue, we see that despite the change in scene, the conversation is not over. Because in the synagogue is a man with a withered hand. And verse 2 says that they, the Pharisees, were watching him to see whether Jesus would cure on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Note that while the withered hand is not life-threatening, and you were allowed to do work that involved saving the life of another on the Sabbath, even though it is not immediately endangering his life, this physical condition would have, in all likelihood, been impacting the man in a number of significant ways. They would have been affecting his ability to earn an income, his social participation, and perhaps even people's perspectives of him. Has he sinned? Is that why he has a withered hand? Now let's consider where the focus of this scene falls, right? While Jesus tells the man to come forward, and before the end of the scene he will be healed, the focus is not really on the man with the withered hand. We don't even get to hear the response of those who witness this miraculous healing. Rather, our eyes are fixed on Jesus, and Jesus' attention is fixed on the Pharisees. This is a showdown. This is a direct challenge to those that are watching him and waiting to accuse him. And it is to them that he addresses his words. Imagine that scene for a moment. I bet you could have heard a pin drop. The man with the withered hand has been called to stand before Jesus. But Jesus addresses his accusers with this question: is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? to save life or to kill. As Boring points out, we hear an echo here of the Deuteronomic choice that Moses puts to Israel in Deuteronomy 30:15-30. Today I have set before you life and death. Choose life. In the person of Jesus, the promise of human wholeness associated with the kingdom is already becoming effective. To postpone healing this man now on the Sabbath, the day when things are to be put right, is not to act unlawfully, but to deny the very onset of the kingdom of God. Jesus' presence is a sign and authorization that this is a time of messianic celebration. The Sabbath is a time for doing good, for relieving suffering. And what is the response to Jesus' question? What is the response to the invitation to see how God's restoration has already begun? Silence. Jesus is met with utter silence. And Mark gives us a glimpse of the rawness of that moment. Jesus' anger and his grief at the hardness of their hearts. It's not just that Jesus' opponents have closed off their feelings, they've shut down their minds. They've refused to consider this deeper purpose of Sabbath. They will not hear what Jesus is trying to tell them. They will not see what he is trying to show them. Jesus says to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out and his hand was restored. This is so great. Do you see the divine passive there? Jesus hasn't even touched him. It's debatable if he's even done work in healing on the Sabbath. But our section ends with these words. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Now, the Pharisees were not naturally aligned with the Herodians, who were part of kind of the Roman machine in a sense, but they brought the political power and the clout that was needed to deal with Jesus. So on this day of life, the Pharisees, who have strongly opposed the healing of a man with a withered hand, they see nothing wrong in using their sacred time to plot how they can destroy Jesus, bringing out even more starkly this contrast presented by Jesus of Sabbath either as a day to do good or to do harm, to save or to kill. The Pharisees have made their choice clear. What about ours? As Wright points out, we can't just simply transfer Israel's Sabbath practice to our Christian Sunday, but neither can we ignore it as some kind of Jewish legalism. Rather, these passages, I want to suggest, present us with the opportunity, among other things, to ask ourselves seriously what it means to be a people whose individual and communal lives point towards the final eschatological restoration of God's kingdom and rule. What does it mean to be people who demonstrate glimpses of that restoration already taking place in the present? What will we do each 7 day that is creative, brings justice and mercy, or healing, or hope, beauty, or love? How will we live into that essential rhythm of work and rest? How will we find rhythms at every stage of life that will sustain us as bearers of life in our homes, our communities, in our nation, in our world? Our lives matter. Our voices count. And in a time in history when we have a greater ability than we ever have before to be seen and heard, I often wonder what it would look like if we took that challenge seriously. What would it look like to be a global community of God's people, linked arms, seeking the good of all? Not trapped in a scarcity mindset, but in the knowledge of the spaciousness of the kingdom, embodying hope, speaking life, doing good. Is this not a call to choose life? Is this not our work? Is this not the call of the Messiah?